Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on addressing the risk landscape to build awareness and resilience, specific to the context of the US in 2024, our elections coming up in November. So I know we have a wide array of different people from different organizations joining us today. We have over 100 registrants, which is amazing. So just to let you know, the flow, the run of the show is that we have about 45 minutes with our panelists, and then the last 15 minutes of this hour will be dedicated to you, our participants, to have questions. And when you do write a question, feel free to use that Q&A function that you have at the bottom of your screen. And you could just put a question there, and please note which person you would like to address that question. So to get us started and to kind of orient ourselves, as you can see on this slideshow, you know, these memories of January 6th, long time ago, could happen again. So the upcoming US elections present this period of risk, which exposes businesses to common public disorder risks, as well as from internal agitators and external hostile nation actors and terror groups. Already we're seeing intelligence reports indicating Russian and other government electoral interference may occur, claims that the election will be rigged, a vocalization by religious extremists that the elections present a fight between good and evil, and a sense across all political parties that the opposition presents the end to America as a global power, if not a nation. So before we go any further, we actually want to hear from you, our participants, of your sense of the state of affairs. So on your screen, you're going to see a series of questions pop up. So please select the best response for your context, and we're actually going to compare the results with the recent academic study that was conducted in the recent months. So here you should see, what do you feel is the likelihood of physical violence occurring? You should see different options there. So please go ahead and submit your vote. And the next question should pop up afterwards. So thank you. I do see the live results coming in. Looks like the majority of you, about 40% or so, do believe that physical violence will be occurring. Second question, do you feel violence will be planned ahead of any public gathering or event? Those results are coming in as well. About 56%. What's going higher? 60%. So great. So thank you so much for contributing to those polls. It's great to know how people are feeling about what's upcoming. So in comparison, a recent academic study involving 67 security risk professionals found that 91% believe that physical violence will occur, and 93% believe that violence will be premeditated. So today's expert panelists will explore the scope of security and business disruption risks specific to those issues, the importance of knowledge, skills, and capacity building, and measures by which to operationalize a resilience program against the potential risks associated with US elections. So it is my pleasure to introduce each panelist. Upcoming first, we have Jan van der Ven, who is the head of Integrated Crisis Management for Cognizant. So you can see on the slide here the description of Cognizant and what they do. But for Jan specifically, he's a former law enforcement officer and has had a diverse career across a multitude of industries, including banking, pharmaceuticals, security, and IT services. He has led diverse teams across the globe driving security and resilience programs. So Jan is currently leading Cognizant's integrated risk management team globally. And next, my pleasure to introduce you is Kenya Casey, who is the new Deputy Chief Operating Officer for the Task Force for Global Health, where she provides strategic business and operational support. She was formerly the Director of Global Safety and Security at Emory University, where she focused on enhancing the health, safety, and security of staff and students during international travel. And next we have Michael O'Neill, who held the position of chair for INSA, which is the International NGO Safety and Security Association, and is now an advisory board member. Michael began his professional security risk management career in 1995, working for the Peace Corps. Afterwards, he was then Director of Global Safety and Security at Save the Children for 15 years. He's currently the President and CEO of O'Neill Paragon Solutions. And next we have Colin Brown. He's the Managing Director for the Sigma 7 RSM Resilience and Security Practice. Colin has over 24 years in the sector with previous appointments such as Chief Security Officer, Chief Advisory Security, and President. He has graduate degrees from HEC, Paris Oxford University, Cranfield University, and Cambridge University. He's also a graduate of the Joint Services Advanced Command and Staff College and is an accredited leadership coach and non-executive director. And next, we have Dr. Mike Blythe. He's the Sigma 7 Chief Revenue Officer. Mike has a doctorate degree in business administration focused on organizational resilience and a master's degree in security risk management. He is a published author in academic journals, magazines, and books on resilience and business continuity and security risk management. He's a retired major in the Royal Marine Commando. A fun fact about Mike is that he has lived or worked in more than 45 countries. So again, at the end of the session, we'll be taking questions from you, the participants. So please do, note down your questions as we go through, the panelists, and please include who this should be asked to in the chat box. Also to note, at the end of this webinar, Sigma 7 will be providing free resources as well as helpful, and we'll give you more information about that. So stay tuned for that. All right, so let's start with our first question to each of our panelists. So when we're talking about resilience, so resilience means different things to different people and organizations. So as such, I just want to tackle the issue of what resilience means with each speaker to provide context to their observations and recommendations. Afterwards, I'll go into a little bit more of a dialogue with each speaker just to kind of set the stage a bit more. So Jan, let's turn to you.
Yeah, so resilience from my side, right, most importantly is knowing the risks to your organization. What can happen? What impacts would that have on my organization? Am I prepared to respond to those, especially those with significant impacts? And what am I missing? What else do I need to do? And it's important to have a defined structure in place to address that. Proper teams, plans, and processes, right? So you can prepare for, respond to, and recover from any of those risks that come up. And also important as well is once that's established is making sure that you test it and apply the lessons learned, because nothing is perfect and everything on paper looks great. But when you exercise it and you test it, you find where your gaps are, right? And being able to take that and then apply those lessons learned to improve your program, I think is very critical for resilience. And at the end of the day, you want to keep your associates safe and you want to be able to continue to manage your operations and deliver. So that's how I say it.
Thank you, Jan. Appreciate the response. Colin, let's go over to you.
Thanks, Sandra. Yeah, great question. For me, it's about the ability of the organization to continue to meet its obligations, no matter what gets thrown in its pathway. So whether those obligations are financial, whether they're social obligations, contractual obligations, or obligations in terms of duty of care. And so typically it crosses the ability to understand the risk environment that an organization is operating in and developing the appropriate management plans to control that risk, being prepared to respond to incidents that may occur and preventing those incidents from turning into a crisis, and to having the business continuity plans in place to return the organization back to where it needs to be to meet its obligations. So effectively, resilience for me covers all of those aspects, focused on enabling the organization to continue as it intends to.
Thank you, Colin. Kenya, let's switch over to you.
Great, thank you. So I would say, again, it's imperative to develop leadership knowledge and experience focused on incident crisis management, and that goes across all sectors, corporate, NGO, including higher education. I can't leave my higher education colleagues out of this. And the training, and you'll hear a lot of redundancy, and we're going to say this over and over again, training and practicing procedures, testing to see the resilience strategies. Do they work? How well are the leaders implementing them? And this builds confidence in leadership. It builds confidence in those that are responding to the crises. And this applies to key stakeholders, the key players, and this shows how we handle potential risk. And so the time spent training executives, site managers, HR personnel, program providers who are in education abroad, those specialists, the crisis management team and staff. And so this is an investment in the organization overall. And I'll keep repeating this, that this builds trust among colleagues and individuals, and it makes the team stronger. And then you're more effective when dealing with complex and urgent crises.
Thank you, Kenya. Michael, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. We look at resilience as the ability to withstand adversity and then bounce back. And like everyone else, first it's understanding who you are as an organization and what your vulnerabilities are, and assessing specific risks related to your personnel, your operations, your assets, your reputation. And all of those things can be complicated in a dynamic environment. Next is to develop your policies, procedures, and tools to mitigate the identified risks. And as everybody else mentioned, orientate, train, and drill your leadership and your staff to build individual and organizational capacity. And then, it's a constant dynamic environment. So you have to constantly reassess the risks and adapt measures accordingly. And this is all in support of operations. As much as it's important to keep our staff safe and mitigate risk as best we can, the real objective is to continue delivering the services that people have become reliant upon in order to further the mission of the respective organizations.
Thank you, Michael. And Mike.
Everything they said. No, I think they've hit upon some very good points. I think from my perspective is map, evaluate, prioritize, and then address all forms of risk, whether they affect people, operations, facilities, asset, information, and also critically the reputation of an organization. Without an organization's reputation, basically all of the other aspects are harmed. I think it's important to codify knowledge through document systems, but also to understand that you both need structure as well as flexibility to address what you can predict, and then of course the evolving emergent threats that you can't predict. And then you need to operationalize it through knowledge building and training exercising solutions, whether it's training individual staff members at the lowest level so that they can perform self-help measures, then all the way up through local management teams and into the executive team. And then you need to then determine where to assign limited resources, time, money, and bandwidth in order to address the most prominent high impact and fast burn threats, and build competence and competence within the team, confidence and competence within the team, so that when they are faced with a new threat, it can be very stressful for individuals and teams, that they can react in a timely and effective manner.
Thank you, Mike. And I will mention to our participants that this webinar is being recorded and will be available afterwards. Feel free to share with your colleagues or anyone that you feel that this could be helpful for. So now we're going to switch gears, and I'm going to have a brief conversation with each panelist for a few minutes each. And again, question period is coming up at 11:45 my time Eastern. So Jan, so you're going to be up first. So first question, the scope of risk facing organizations is broad and complex. So how do you see the election risks potentially affecting not only your people, but also your organizational business interests?
Yeah, I think when we look at it right now, the world's in a bit of a fragile space, right? We have a big increase in social disorder and political disorder around the world, right? We can see the examples of that across Europe and the UK, the Middle East, the US, Latin America. Multiple conflicts and wars ongoing at the same time as well, which feed into that. So I think at the end of the day, when we look at the US elections, there's a lot, especially with the amount of rhetoric that we have around it, right? From both sides of the fence at the end of the day, creates a large risk for social disorder, right? And we've seen it in the past. It's not something that hasn't occurred. I think we've seen multiple instances of it, and it continues to build. So I see social disorder itself as being one of the primary risks that we will face and that we continue to face in regards to that, right? And that's why I think it's important, right? Know what your risks are as an organization and how would that apply? How close am I to hotspots or centers where that occurs more often? Do I have a customer facing business, right? Do I need to be able to get my employees into client sites to support that? Do I need to move logistics from place to place? And how would social disorder fit into that, right? And I think that's important to consider, because if I need to move product from one side of the country to the other, that might become exceedingly difficult if there's wide-scale social disorder. There's a risk of elevated cyber attacks as well, especially if you are in the political arena or you're supporting the election process, right? There's lots of rhetoric around influencing elections and trying to do what needs to be done. So if your business is involved in those aspects, there should be an expectation of elevated risk from cyber attack, in addition to what I think the world is seeing in general as it is. And then you have additional risk from terroristic or disruptive attacks as well, right? And I think that's ongoing, whether or not connected or not. It's something that needs to be considered. And I think it also needs to be considered if we're looking at the US election specifically. It's not just in a lead up to the election. It's not just after the election. I think it's an extended period of time, and we should be very conscious of that, right? With a very prime window being pretty much from, in the US, that election day through the inauguration and probably a little bit after, if we look at past instances as well. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And so with risk usually comes impact. So what potential impacts do you think that these risks may have on your staff and your organization based on their sector or industry?
Yeah, I'll make sure I wasn't on mute there, because I know I clicked it on. I clicked it off again. Yeah, listen, at the end of the day, different organizations will have different types of risk, right? And I think I brought that up a little bit in the last question. If I need to move product from one side of the country to another, I have a strong reliance on logistics and transport. I need to evaluate how that might be impacted. What do I do if there is no way to get product from my manufacturing plant to distribution, right? Very critical if you're moving product from side to side. Am I keeping my associates safe? At the end of the day, is probably the most important thing. They drive everything that you do, regardless of the industry that you're in. So are you doing what's necessary to keep them safe? If something were to break out in a particular location where you have facilities, how are you keeping them safe? Do you have indicators prior, right? If there's a planned protest, what are you doing? What's your plan if a planned protest is set to occur there, right? How do I keep my associates safe? If you have time to move them to alternate locations, go to a work from home model if you're not already doing that. I know that's very common now after COVID. These are all things that need to be looked at, right? And if something starts to break out or you start to see widespread social unrest, a lot of people are not going to want to go places. They're going to want to probably more likely be at home and stay at home. There's not going to be as much desire. So you need to be ready for that and even proactively plan for that wherever possible. And now a lot of people work from home. So are you taking that into consideration? If they're working from home, they're bound to the same facilities and infrastructure that everybody else is. If they don't have power at home because there's widespread social unrest and infrastructure starts to get impacted, how are you addressing that, right? Are you considering reverse, right? Bringing people back into an office where they might not have been, where you have better infrastructure capabilities, as long as it's in a safe area, obviously. Travel, right, can be impacted. The facilities themselves, some facilities may be more important than others. Data centers, manufacturing centers, distribution centers, delivery centers, quite critical to most people's businesses. And how are you protecting those? How are you ensuring you're able to operate? Because in social unrest, vandalism, destruction, impacts to infrastructure, all these things will affect the organization or your particular organization. So you need to be prepared for that and make sure the right redundancies are there so you continue to do what you need to do. And if you can't, because it's not safe to do it, hopefully you're able to do it somewhere else, right? And being able to use alternate locations. And I know I brought up cyber risk before, right? And I think probably the higher risk, if we're looking at the US election specifically, more for those in the political arena, directly in support of politics of one party or another, or involved in the polling. I think it should be a real hard look on making sure that you have some elevated controls in regards to that if you don't already.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you. So this next question is one that I'll be asking each of the panelists, and that is, what would be the top 5 things that you would advise resilience and risk leaders to be focused on in terms of threats to their organizations?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's fairly simple, right? And I think it draws a lot on what what I've already said and what some of the other panelists have already said to some degree, right? What are my risks? One, right? I need to know what my risks are. Do a risk assessment. Make sure you understand them. What impacts me? What is going to potentially impact my organization? And how do I address that? Make sure you have a structure in place, right? Have teams in place, teams that have been trained, teams that know what they're doing, and they have plans to support those responses, right? Because coming up with a plan on the fly, way more complicated than if you already have it set and you're prepared and you know what to do. Because there will always be little pieces that you're going to have to do on the fly regardless, because no plan is perfect. But have those plans in place. Make sure that everybody knows what to do when that occurs. Make sure that everybody is aware of what they need to do, right? So having a plan is great, but if the bottom level doesn't understand how they fit into that plan, that's a problem. Because trying to tell a large group of people what they need to do when it's actually happening is way more complex than being prepared and knowing what to do. More at the push of a button than anything else, right? And evaluating what those plans are. Make sure that they make sense. Sometimes people have great intentions, right? Put together a plan, it sits there for 10 years, hasn't been dusted off, doesn't apply anymore because the dynamic has changed so much, right? Evaluate your plans, take a look at them, make sure they still work. And probably one of the most important, because a lot of people I think have the opportunity to do these things, they have that structure in place, but they don't test it. And testing it through live fire is not optimal. Then you learn your gaps, and if you learn your gaps when it's actually happening, that's painful. But testing, conducting exercises, going through learning where my gaps are and mitigating them makes responding to an actual event, especially a large scale event, way easier.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you so much. I already see some questions coming through, which is excellent. So folks, please feel free to use the question function, and I am monitoring it. And again, we will be posing these to our panelists at the end. So next up, we have Colin. So Colin, we're talking about building an effective organizational resilience strategy. So building such a strategy to protect people, facilities, operations, and the organization's reputation can be really complex. What would be the main areas you would advise people to focus on to get started?
I think recognize the complexity, first of all. There's two things here to think about, a minimum of two things. One is technically, what is it that we're trying to achieve? When you're inside an organization, that's the easier thing to do. The harder thing is, how do we actually achieve it and build collaboration within the organization to achieve resilience? It sounds dead straightforward, but typically it's easy to define what needs to be done. It's far harder to actually get it done. And there's reasons for that. So most organizations have complex layers of responsibility. And it's not as if you're the lead for resilience that you also control all the budgets. You're reliant on other people to allocate budget to your tasks. You're reliant on other elements of the organization to provide expert input into the plans that you develop. So thinking about that level of complexity and recognizing from the outset that building an approach that includes the relevant departments, that includes the relevant stakeholders from the outset is key, or building a resilient strategy will come to a grinding halt very, very quickly. I think the second aspect is being really, really clear on why you're doing it. So we can generically talk about, developing a resilient strategy, but you need to get to a point where you're deciding what is it that you're developing resilience against, and what is it you're designing and developing resilience for. And so a simple kind of test there is to really understand what is critical to the organization's continued survival and success. So why is that important? Because resources are always very, very difficult to achieve. There is never enough time to get stuff done. And so you have to work through a system of prioritization to ensure that your resources, the time that you have, is focused on what's most important. I think the final thing that or two final things that I'd bring in there. One is, I think for a lot of organizations, they try and go from the beginning to the end as quickly as possible. Reality is these journeys are not like that. And any organization is going to kind of move through different levels of maturity in terms of the resilience they achieved, which is specific to their context. Not every organization needs to be resilient against everything. Some organizations need to be resilient against very, very specific issues that could affect their kind of commitments to clients or to shareholders or to other stakeholders. And I think, my own experience is kind of being really clear on the value proposition, because ultimately, if you are the lead inside an organization with responsibility for resilience, you have to sell it. You have to be able to articulate a compelling reason why an organization is going to invest in building a resilient strategy. And if you can't articulate that, and you can't articulate the destination you're driving towards and why it's important, then it's highly unlikely you're going to get the resources to be able to execute it.
Definitely. Thank you, Colin. So also given your experience, especially with the different titles that you've held, how important do you feel timely and accurate intelligence is with respect to potential threats?
I think it's everything. If you think about the risk process, if you think about this from a security context, we're trying to understand who our potential adversaries are and how they might harm us. And that covers everything from kind of physical issues through to cyber. So, without that input into a risk management process, you're shooting blind. You cannot be effective if you do not understand, what those threats look like. I think the layer of complexity that often gets missed here, which is essential, is that, those adversaries, there may be consistent threats that apply to all organizations. There'll be some threats that apply to some, and there'll be other threats that apply to very, very specific individuals, departments, or operations with an organization that could be driven by their profile or geography. So kind of going back to basics when you're thinking about this and developing a very, very clear intelligence collection plan that is appropriate for your organization is the essential step. And that doesn't matter if you're using open source or you're using many of the proprietary systems that are out there at the moment. Understanding what the collection plan is for your particular organization is the first step to ensuring that you do understand the threat environment in which you're operating.
Thank you, Colin. And so just as asked to Jan, what would the top 5 things that you would advise resilience and risk leaders to be focused on in order to establish those scalable resilient strategies?
Yeah, I think I'm going to come at it slightly differently. So I'm going to come at this from an organizational perspective. I think first one is communicate concerns. So, there can be a tendency for experts to talk with other experts about their concerns and not talk to the people that actually need to make the decisions. So kind of really be clear, articulate why it needs to be done, and get that communication across to the people that ultimately make the decisions, whether you're going to start to build out increased resilience or not. And, if you can get the stakeholders' support by clear communications, you have a great opportunity of executing a program. Without that support, it would go nowhere. I think the second thing is be realistic. So, I think a common failure, and I certainly have this, is, in 5 weeks, I want to change the world. It is not going to happen. So if we think about the US elections and how much time we have now, if organizations are not yet in the frame of doing stuff, realize the most important constraint that you've got is time. There's 5 weeks. So the second point is be really clear what you can achieve within the time frame and make sure you achieve what can be achieved. Third one is kind of thinking about organizational complexity. So, The idea of us kind of charging forward as professionals to get this done on our own sounds great, but in reality, it won't happen. So I think identifying who your key collaborators are and stakeholders internally in the organization in this process, and creating a forum, and think about this in the context of the elections coming up, creating a forum that builds that communication and that internal network across the areas of the business that need to be connected is a very, very important step to get an organizational response rather than a departmental response led by security or resilience. The other two things that we've heard, and Jan kind of has already reiterated this, is get a plan. It might not be a perfect plan, but get a plan. And secondly, rehearse the team on that plan.
Thank you, Colin. All right, Kenya.
Thank
Let's
you.
move over to you. So Kenya, what level of importance do you place on building executive level knowledge and skills, and what are the key areas of learning?
Great, thank you. Like I said earlier, I'll constantly reinforce the importance of developing crisis management skills for executive leaders. We can't overstate this enough. And oftentimes it's the executive leaders, the decision makers who may be a little bit more far removed from what's happening on the ground, depending on how large the organization is. And so being proactive around safety and security is important. And again, I would say the areas that we need to focus on is crisis management, prevention strategies, and then of course the business continuity. And whether we're in the NGO sector, higher education, we rely very heavily on our assistance providers and also the security organizations that we partner with. And the skill set that they provide and the knowledge is valuable. And we also need to maintain a strong grasp of industry standards, best practices. And you'll see this in many organizations. You have the long tenured leaders who have been in the organization for many years. And there's a certain level of complacency and familiarity with the organization and how things run. And I've been in 3 organizations in the past 10 years. And I hear this is how we've been doing it. Things have worked. We haven't had any crises. And again, the climate is changing. And so it's crucial to stay current and informed about crisis management and relating it to the election. And people want to know, what are the tangibles? What can we do to prepare? Looking at the knowledge and skills. So it's asking the right question. What questions are we asking? How many organizations are truly prepared for potential disruption? I'm in Georgia, and in Georgia, early voting starts October 15th. So that means, is your office located? The questions that we should be asking, again, is your office located near a polling station? For our global community, we have a lot of travelers overseas. What are their potential risks? How can we prepare then? And so again, asking the right questions to leadership so that you're helping them think through building their knowledge on crisis management as it relates to the election coming up and the early voting. And as Jan said, so we basically have the next 4 months that we have to think through what will potential disruption look like, and not alarming. We're not necessarily alarming, but what I found that is when we prepare and build that resiliency, then it builds the confidence in our colleagues, and it builds, again, the trust within the crisis management team.
Thank you, Kenya. If we could dive a little bit more specifically into that, what are the key learning areas for staff? And are there any specific individuals or groups who you think might be more at risk and might require additional levels of support?
Yes, so I always like to start with that situational awareness. And that's for any incident. We have to have situational awareness, cultural competency is key because there's different populations, there's vulnerable populations that we have to take into consideration. Cyber security, crisis management, and then de-escalation techniques. And this is, again, is our office located near a polling station? Are we at risk based on the position that we hold in an organization? Could our colleagues traveling overseas encounter people who are really curious or have strong opinions about what's happening in this election or a stance that our president has taken? Do they have the skill set to de-escalate a particular situation? And so again, focusing on those areas, and then also looking at the vulnerable population as it relates to crisis management. We can't ignore the social climate. There's an increase in hate crimes for vulnerable groups. So that includes racial minorities, housing insecure individuals, people with disabilities, the LGBTQIA community, and then the elderly. The elderly are that's a population that we have to think about during the election. And so these groups require unique consideration in emergency planning. And that also applies to our community, our travelers, our colleagues that are overseas. Those populations are vulnerable, especially when you're thinking about the racial minorities and the LGBTQIA communities, and those from different ethnic groups because of the current political climate that we're in.
Thank you, Kenya. So moving on to the top 5, what were the top 5 things that you would advise resilience and risk leaders to be focused on in terms of developing and testing skills and knowledge?
So prioritizing training, I'm going to keep saying that, for our risk leaders and also for staff. Again, it equips them with the knowledge and skills to identify, assess, and mitigate risk. And then my favorite, I love a good tabletop exercise, doing that annually. And this goes to my higher ed professionals as well, the tabletop exercise for handling these global crises. And then those of us who are handling both domestic and international, exercising to uncover the vulnerabilities. Collaboration is key for risk leaders. I'm always trying to stay connected to other security professionals because, again, when there's a crisis, you need to tap into that community, and they also might have security plans and resources that you might not have access to. And then the good old SOPs, having those SOPs, not the long ones, have a page or two that helps people really walk through, this is what to do in a crisis.
Thank you, Kenya. So I see some more questions coming in, so feel free to use that function for participants. And now we're going to switch over to Michael and understanding more about the political risks. So given that one of the current candidates' policies includes deporting over 10 million illegal immigrants, what threats do you feel this presents to organizations? Oh, Michael, you're on mute. Happens to the best of us. That's all right.
There you go. Yeah. So thank you. The anti-immigrant rhetoric, our concern is that it may inspire individual actors to target organizations or refugee populations, and or to have them participate in demonstration, protests, harassment, threats, or direct action against the providers to refugee settlement or to the refugees themselves. Related to that are targeted attacks on certain groups based on disinformation, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. The classic example that we can talk about is what's happening in Springfield, Ohio today. And, a Facebook statement has become a national issue of misinformation. And finally, they're having organizations specifically targeted for a disinformation campaign that undermines the work of the organization, that puts its people at risk, and really could have a negative impact on their delivery of services or donor giving.
Thank you for that. So we do have some participants who are with organizations whose staff are involved in activism, human rights, election monitoring, or just general demonstrations. So what do you feel are the risks to both people and their employers in terms of that context?
Well, I think it's, staff, affiliate, and client stress and concerns have negatively impacting their mental health and well-being is a key thing. I think that people are being, in a way, demonized for the work that they're doing on behalf of disadvantaged populations. And this is coming, it's coming, the threats are coming at them, at low level, but persistently and from different directions. Another thing could be landlords forcing relocation or reduction of services because they feel that the organizations that they're hosting are drawing unwanted attention to their physical facilities. Another issue is conflating personal political activities with organizational advocacy and priorities. Within our organizations, we are giving out guidance. Your civil responsibilities of participating in the election have to be different than your advocacy position within your organization, and not conflating those two. If you have a personal position on an international activity going on right now, conflicts or whatever, you shouldn't be wearing the branded attire of your organization if you're out there on a personal mission. And if you are going to participate in protests and demonstrations, take reasonable precautions in case things go south. Drink plenty of water, have your lawyer's telephone number, and on and on and on. We have separate guidance that we've developed on these things. And finally, the real thing is being targeted for direct violence. This is the key thing, and we have seen this already happening. People being, hostile surveillance and doxing and these kinds of things are happening already. And we are preparing our staff to think through these activities that we're having. Do we need to accelerate activities in certain areas or reduce activities in certain areas to manage our relative vulnerability?
Thank you, Michael. So what are some top 5 things that organizations should be doing ahead of the elections?
First thing is understand your operational context, and others mentioned about potential threats and risks, but we're also looking at who are key stakeholders and who are your potential allies and your supporters, and develop this relationships and start having these discussions now. And I'm talking about local law enforcement, local political authorities or administrative authorities, your allies, your advocates. Find out from them. First of all, you're developing a broader collaborative base to monitor what's happening and gather information and process it collectively, so you have a better whole of threat environment around what we're looking at, right? And also you're developing potential response capacities from different directions. Just as much the threats are coming from a different direction, the responses can also be coming through the local law enforcement. So have them come to your office and do a walkthrough. Have them attend some of your activities so you have this positive affiliation prior to the elections occurring. The second is to encourage your staff and your affiliates to report any concerns or incidents that they're having, even if they don't seem so serious at the time. Hostile surveillance or somebody showing up at the office uninvited, or ambush journalists or people trying to lure you into provocative conversations, things of that nature, which may not feel like a physical threat, but are part of a broader pattern of perhaps disinformation or targeting. As everybody has mentioned also, training staff and affiliates and clients, first of all, on their personal security, media and communications guidance and messaging, de-escalation techniques, especially among traumatized populations, active incident management, and business continuity planning. All of these things need to be trained and drilled. And again, on the one hand, we have firm knowledge about a date. We know the election date is coming. We know when early elections start. We know when the swearing in is. And the clock is ticking. These are not going to change. And so we have to get on our preparations and our response capacity right now. And finally, just go with, at least in our situation, we have so many different office configurations. We have people working out of houses, out of high rises, out of combined office buildings, out of municipal buildings. Each one of those needs to be reviewed for physical security on access and perimeter control, sheltering in place, CCTV, making sure you have proper egress strategies in case your facilities are targeted by what we call awful but lawful interventions. You know, you have these unregulated militias showing up outside your property with weapons and camouflage attire to intimidate. They're not breaking any law, but we need to know if this happens, what is the strategy for reducing the risk to the organization and maintaining services at an agreeable level.
Thank you, Michael. So now we're going to switch over to Mike, and Mike's going to bring us home with a discussion on best practice, standards, and operationalizing resilience. So the previous speakers have discussed risks and the requirement to build effective management structures and document systems. So how do you feel these might be developed against best practices and recognized standards that we have currently?
I think the first thing is to identify what standards exist, whether they're ISO, BSI, NIST, COOP, and others, and to identify the value that they could bring, not only in kind of shaping good ideas and approaches, but also the difference between alignment and certification. So buying an ISO standard costs a couple of $100. Going through an audit costs tens of thousands of dollars. So really, you know, so long as you're aligned and you're leveraging that good benchmark information and concepts, that's probably good enough for most organizations. They don't necessarily need to go to the expensive, laborious process of certification. And you can also do that within your industry or sector as well, drawing upon the research done by INSA and other groups to say what is out there that we could leverage and adjust to suit our purposes. And then also on the training front, as mentioned by Kenya and others, what certifications go with training? You know, is it ILM, ACES, INSA, where you can get CPs and accreditations and recognition for good, solid knowledge and skills building. And then the final thing when designing standards aligned or compliant systems is the difference between good content that operationalizes practices to address risk, and also where it provides insulation against reputational litigation threats as well. And they don't need to be a binary choice. You can actually address both good content and reputational litigation protection at the same time, leveraging some of these standards.
Thank you, Mike. So along those lines, when developing training programs and content, how can organizations get the right knowledge to the right people at the right time?
Great question. It's very difficult. People have dispersed learner groups. There's multiple learner groups. As you mentioned, there are, or Kenya mentioned, there are vulnerable populations within there that makes it a complicated learning strategy. So the first thing you need to do is do a training needs analysis. It doesn't have to be difficult, laborious, but you need to identify who are the learner groups. Are there subsets within that learner group that need particular attention or support? And then you build out a competency framework to address that. The competency framework would identify the value of outsourcing or internal building mechanisms. How quickly do you need to build it? Do you have the right resources in-house, or do you need to go for external support? Can you get accreditation in-house, out-house? And then just the complexity of building content as well, whether it's structured training, where it's a learning journey or defined learning outcomes for a particular group, or whether you have a just-in-time training program as well that is available to meet emergent, unforeseen threats, something you could trigger at a moment's notice to address a particular requirement, whether it's before, during, or after a crisis. The training also needs to be relevant to the learner. It needs to resonate. It needs to be sticky and interesting and something they want to learn and they will retain. And it needs to be delivered in a way that they will retain that information over the long term. Learning information by reading, the retention rates are very low. By doing, by having a tabletop exercise, by going through simulations where it can be achieved, they'll remember that for a long term, and it'll be more relevant when they need to apply some or all of that knowledge. And then you need to think about, how do you get that information out there? Is it through instructor-led training, which is great, but is resource heavy and is constrained by geography and resources that can get out to the learner group, certainly if things are unfolding on the ground? Or is it through digital training or exercising or video games? Or is it a blend of all of that? And then the final thing is, are you trying to give knowledge and skills to people, or are you also trying to track their ability to use that knowledge? So certainly for leaders, you want to make sure that they're able to activate that knowledge in an effective manner. For staff, it's a bit more difficult to evaluate. Have they absorbed it? Will they be able to use it? At the very least, providing the knowledge and skills is meeting duty of care requirements. Evaluating then is moving to the next level of determining whether or not it's good training and whether or not it's being absorbed and applied effectively.
So in a minute or less, what would be the top 5 things that you recommend for our participants to hear today?
Did you say the top 50 things or the top? Certification is not critical to standards, but certainly alignment is really useful. So go and spend the money to buy ISO 22301 or the relevant standards that deal with crisis and incident management or travel risk management. Have a look at them, absorb the good ideas they offer and work them into your plans. Determine what is mandatory elective training. At the very least, you should make knowledge and skills available to people. Whether or not you force them to do it is another matter. But you're making good duty of care inroads by saying, here is knowledge. We know there are certain threats that we can predict. Go and learn and apply it to yourselves and your families and your work colleagues. Think about document systems that work together. Don't blend policies and plans in with emergency action plans. When you're dealing with a threat, you don't want to go through hundreds of pages of content to find the checklist that you need to use at a moment's notice. So you need to design your document structure that allows for knowledge and standards to be built before threat, and then things that you're going to pull off the shelf and use as you're dealing with a riot, a bomb threat, an active shooter situation, workplace violence, whatever it may be. To various speakers' points, exercise the skills at the individual, site or local and crisis level. See where the gaps exist before a crisis occurs, and then repair those gaps and resolve them so you're not exposing yourself to vulnerability. And then build both structure and flexibility within your approach. Having good policies and plans is great. It provides something people can refer to, it brings consistency to how risks are managed, but also understand that you need a little bit of leadership innovation as well, because not everything will be addressed by your plan.
Definitely. Thank you, Mike. So I do want to turn it over to the participants because we have a couple questions to address. So this probably is a question for Mike. So can you offer some advice on how to prepare organizations for these risks in ways that don't stir up panic? Sometimes just raising these issues can cause alarm and create a distraction from day-to-day work.
Very good question. One way is to use it as a global program. Don't fixate on a particular threat like the elections, but say, we recognize that there's civil disorder worldwide, there's bomb threats worldwide, there's active shooter or armed aggressor worldwide. And as a sensible precaution and to have a mature resiliency strategy, we want to raise knowledge on a global basis, understanding that the trigger may well be the elections, but actually some of the training or a lot of the training will be as relevant for people in the UK, seen by recent incidences, or France, or parts of Africa or the Middle East, as it would be for Americans. That way, a particular group won't feel that they are most at threat. They will just recognize they're part of a global resiliency program.
Thank you, Mike. This next one would be for Michael. So where do you think the potential disorders will occur outside of DC? Are there other specific places, regions that can already be identified? And who can best elaborate on this?
Well, for us, we're encouraging our affiliates to do their own assessment on this, because as we saw with Springfield, out of the blue, suddenly Springfield becomes the epicenter of anti-immigrant interest. And so monitoring social media and being, keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening. And again, as I mentioned before, reaching out to your local stakeholders so we're expanding the sensitivities we have and being able to pick up the signals in as early as possible so we're not caught unawares. So for us, with the U.S. elections, clearly, almost anywhere, especially where we have places where refugees are being housed, where they're being serviced, where for their kids are going to school, for getting jobs, for advocacy. All of these things are across the board in communities large and small across the United States. And so, there's no predictive element here that is going to kind of give a higher priority to this area versus this area. Obviously, Washington, D.C., New York City are common because the UN General Assembly you have in New York City, Washington, D.C. for a lot of advocacy and protest, but there's no place that's off the charts really at this point.
Thank you, Michael. So Kenya, moving over to you, and this is sort of a two-part question, and that's, so since the war started on October 7th, 2023 in Israel, we've seen a rise in student and family activism and violent protests and clashes with law enforcement. So given your previous roles, So first part question is, what do you recommend universities do during the period leading up to the elections, especially if they have a student body that's quite active? And given your role overseeing staff travel, will you be recommending a pause in all staff travel before, during, and after the election period?
Okay, I'll answer the last question first because that's the easier one. We are not pausing travel. And as I mentioned earlier, it's more about ensuring travelers understand the risk, and then they know who to contact if there is a security incident or medical. If someone is attacked, and this, oftentimes we focus on students, but I like to focus on everyone. We talk about being inclusive and equitable and having inclusive and equitable practices. So staff and students who are traveling globally, we're not going to scale back travel unless it's to a high-risk location, but ensuring that people understand what their resources are for support in a security incident or medical. And then the first question is, and my answer will be similar in the sense of knowing who the stakeholders are, knowing what resources are available on campus. Someone reached out to me recently and asked me about an incident that happened in the classroom on campus. And they were trying to identify resources for the faculty member because they needed support in answering one of the questions that came up as a result of, having students in the class who were from Israel and other students who were who were in support of Gaza. And so things came up in the classroom and faculty needed the support in responding. And so having the support in place for faculty so that they feel safe and know how to respond to questions and incidents. And then the students also need resources, both globally, and sometimes the support looks different. So if you have an incident overseas, there might be a different structure in place than what's on campus. And what I try to do at Emory is to replicate what was on campus and ensure, for example, Campus Life had case managers that would support students and know what resources that students could tap into. And then for the faculty and staff, I worked with our HR and our employee assistance program.
Thank you, Kenya. So I know we're at the end of our time together. I do want to call on Mike to discuss the resources that Sigma 7 is offering to all participants, really. These are free resources, and there's an abundance of them to help guide you through this election season. So Mike, over to you very quickly.
Great. So firstly, Sandra, thank you very much for hosting this and moderating it, and also thanks to the speakers. We've got a whole bunch of free stuff that will be useful. There's articles and magazine studies that you can use and extract useful, relevant data to shape your thinking or to present your ideas with some substance to your internal leadership. We've got some example templates for BCPs and emergency action plans and various other things that you can use for your own benefit. And then we have a whole bunch of free online training, both for executive leaders, for site security managers and security professionals, and also for staff as well, that you can leverage. And then we're also releasing, to Colin's point, a monthly quick synopsis of the threat conditions that you can use as well. So give us a shout. We don't expect anything in return from you guys, from the folks watching. We just want to be helpful for the elections. We realize it's quite impactful and very important for people and their teams. And so we will gladly provide access to it for you.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And yes, thank you so much to all our panelists for your valuable insights. Some themes we heard are build redundancy, test everything. Prioritization is key over when limited resources. Test your plan, get a plan. And time, of course, is the biggest constraint, but it's possible. Some of these resources will be immensely valuable to our community. So thank you again. Thank you for your time. It's great to hear from everyone, and thank you to the participants who were able to join us. So all the best.
Thanks.